Next is, we're now going to call our chief guest, Mr. Professor Nicholas A. Robinson. Professor has developed environmental law since 1969 and has been was named to the Legal Advisory Committee of the President Council on Environmental Quality. Professor Saab has practiced environmental law in law firms and as the General Counsel of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He's drafted New York wetlands and wild bird laws and has inaugurated as the first chairman of both the Statutory Freshwater Wetlands Appeal Board and Greenway Heritage Conservancy of the Hudson River Valley. Professor Saab has served as legal advisor and chairman of the Commission on Environmental Law of the International Union of the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, and has been engaged in drafting treaties and counseling different countries on the preparation of their environmental laws. Sir has also edited the proceedings of the 1992 United Nations Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and is the author of several books and numerous articles. Sir, welcome to Pakistan, and please thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and privilege to be with you today, Mr. Chief Justice, honorable judges, the honorable members of the Lahore High Court Bar Association, all of us friends of the environment here, I think, today. After all of these wonderful introductory remarks, I feel like I have come home. This really is a place in which the environmental laws and values are understood. The difficulty of observing them is understood, and we all struggle to figure out the pathway forward. I would like to express my thanks for you being here, but especially I understand that two members of the Lahore High Court Bar Association passed today, and I wish to extend my condolences to their families and to all of you. The Judiciary of Pakistan stands out internationally as one of the great court systems of the world. And the Lahore High Court, of course, as you understand, is at the leading edge of this. Courts have made the environment not just a slogan in legislation, not just a press release from environment ministries or governments, but an operational principle in which our judicial system has to begin to do its time-honored function of achieving justice for the people. And it's more than human rights, because it took us a long time to learn human rights, but we have now come to the point of understanding that there is a right to the environment, and that the environment itself, as part of God's creation, may have rights that we as humans are affecting, perhaps even denying, as we damage the global environment. So public interest jurisprudence has emerged as a way to engage all of society in this quest for environmental justice and the environmental rule of law. And the judiciary in Pakistan has led the way internationally in showing how this can be done. We live in an historic moment. We have an unusual consensus right now in the United Nations surrounding the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals try to integrate all aspects of not just environmental well-being, but educational well-being, the right to education, the rights of women and gender balance, the rights of all people to have potable water, and then above all, the question of coping with climate change. You can, of course, read these Sustainable Development Goals and study them, but it's interesting that in developing these goals, we also reveal not just the consensus that we need better action, but the difficulty of attaining the goals themselves. Why is this so? Well, first, if you look at climate change, which is the overarching question affecting the future of our children and our grandchildren and all of the environment, Section 13 of the Sustainable Development Goals encourages us to work on climate change, but says really we should do so through the Framework Convention on Climate Change and ultimately the Paris Agreement. That was done because people weren't quite ready in the General Assembly to integrate climate change into each one of the Sustainable Development Goals. It was thought of as something separate, something outside of education or water rights and so on. And this reflects the fact that the diplomats have not caught up with environmental jurisprudence. They're still looking at the environment as a sectoralized activity in which different functions require different kinds of laws or reactions. If you take a look at Sustainable Goals 14 and 15, 15 is all about protection of the terrestrial environment, because we have seen the earth around us, our habitat for species, the areas affected by floods or droughts. We have seen the danger that the natural environment is suffering. And we said, time to fix that. We have to be very effective in protecting the terrestrial environment. But when it comes to the marine environment, where none of us live underwater, we don't see what's happening to the marine environment. They don't talk about the extreme protection of the marine environment that is necessary. Rather, the diplomats talk about still reasonable use, let's use as much as we can for as long as we can, and so on. In fact, the oceans are as bad right now in terms of the impact of human society on the oceans as the land or the air. The oceans have acidified very rapidly ever since we began burning coal and oil and gas. The carbon dioxide has been absorbed into the ocean. It's changing the patterns of ocean life. We've dumped chemicals from our rivers into the oceans in vast amounts all over the world, and we've interrupted the food chain for the fish that we all love and depend upon. So oceans are at risk just like land is at risk, but we haven't quite realized that in the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, when the Sustainable Development Goals were being negotiated in the General Assembly, twice they didn't want to put the rule of law into the Sustainable Development Goals. There was halfway through a 3-year negotiation, they took an extra week to negotiate because they didn't know whether they could reference it or not. When it was finally adopted, they put a clause in that said, oh yes, in development goal number 16, we should recognize one of the indicators of a just society is the rule of law. The diplomats weren't quite ready to accept what the judges and the lawyers have understood for centuries, that without order and justice, we won't, and what the UN Environment Program and IUCN are calling the environmental rule of law, we won't have a legal fairness or an environment to protect. So we have to retrofit all of the Sustainable Development Goals and interpret them through the lens of environmental justice. This is a big challenge because we're only at the beginning of this campaign. It's an intergenerational struggle. It's one that your judiciary is well advanced in understanding, and that is why I think the decisions that come out of the Lahore High Court and Pakistan's courts and the Supreme Court need to be studied internationally. Dr. Hassan and I worked on the creation with our colleagues in IUCN and UNEP of a Global Judicial Institute on the Environment. The Global Judicial International Covenant on Environment and Development was drafted and negotiated, and the commentaries were written on it. It was given to the UN. And it is the basis for the proposal that France has brought to the General Assembly. The principles and the commentaries from years of work have been distilled into this concept of a global pact for the environment. It's being debated right now in Nairobi. The UN General Assembly called for an international consultation about how we should codify and agree on these principles from all different legal systems. The General Assembly called for the UN Secretary General to issue a report on international environmental law, the gaps that might exist in it, and the ways we have to agree on principles to better inform our adherence to a global view for stewardship of the earth. That report is available to each one of us. It's online. It was issued on December 3rd. You can get it from the UN website. We promptly responded to it with the international jurists issued several reports commending it. And in those reports, we cited, in fact, the jurisprudence of Pakistan as an example of how the principles can be implemented. These are principles that have action attached to them. They are not just rhetoric. They are not just calls for good behavior, but they have a methodology that lets us observe and enhance the protection of the environment. Most of the principles, including the right to a healthy environment, will be familiar to you, but there are some that are new. For instance, the principle of resilience. The principle of resilience needs to be entered into our practice of law, into our court orders, and into the behavior of not just government, but all forms of society. If you don't plan for the potential disruption of your supply chain, if you're a business enterprise, you will be surprised and be unable to fulfill your production requirements or supply your goods when the supply chain is interrupted because of a bad storm or some other accident. So you have preparedness, you have backup plans, you have secondary plans. We have this idea of not just dealing with the minimum that we need to get through success with, but having backup plans so that if, for instance, in our schools, a teacher cannot appear one day, there's a substitute teacher that can appear, and so on. We have to take that philosophy of resilience and translate it into all forms of behavior, so that we can now plan for the day when we will either have too much rainwater or too little rainwater. We have changed in the climate the hydrologic cycle, and the winds that bring rainwater around the world in all parts of the earth have changed. We don't know how they will continue to change in the future, because we've never changed the earth as we are today. It's a very interesting time to study the earth because it's a new earth. The earth each one of us was born in is not the earth that we have today, and it will not be the earth we pass from and on to our children and grandchildren. I was with scientists recently that gave me two rather alarming reports. One is that the conversion of much of the Amazon rainforest into soybean farming and agriculture is causing a change in the internal hydrology of the Amazon basin. And the Amazon is like the lungs of the earth. It and the Congo, the African, Central American Congo forests, actually make their own rainwater. They are a self-contained hydrology. And if you alter them, then you shift the patterns of water in the atmosphere. They call in the Amazon what happens the rivers in the sky. Rivers are not just on the ground everywhere. There's a flow of water that flows all around the Amazon. Now, if that changes, we have different patterns of atmospheric conditions that will affect other parts of the world, perhaps all parts of the world. The other big change that's happening is one that I first observed when I was traveling to many of the international meetings that Parvez Hassan and I have had to attend in promoting environmental law. I took off from New York, from the airport. I was flying to China. In those days, you could fly over the North Pole. It was one of the very first flights after the end of the Cold War, and we were able to fly over parts of Siberia and the People's Republic of China. They established new routes. And after taking off, the captain came on. It was about an hour outside of New York, flying north. Said, we're getting close to the North Pole. If anyone would like to look out the window, it'll be on the right. There's a magnetic field shift here, so we're flying on on manual. We can't use instruments because it interferes with our equipment. And I was awake, and so I was afraid everyone would get up out of their seats, run to the right-hand side of the plane, look out the window, and we'd all tilt a little bit. In fact, only a handful of us staggered over to the windows and opened them and looked out. And I expected to see white. I expected to see the ice-covered Arctic. Instead, what I saw were large rivers of black. The water was black. There was nothing to reflect color in it. And big islands of white. Because what had happened was the western Arctic had already begun to melt and break up. I was watching a global change in what had been the Arctic become open water. We now have agreements with the Soviet Union, with Russia, the former Soviet Union, to allow cargo ships to go across the Arctic. So you can go from Asia to Rotterdam with large ships. We've just decided, the United States and Russia, to delineate the ship passage through the Bering Sea in such a way as to protect the natural habitats there. I'm proud to say that environmentalists on both sides of that border were very effective with the International Maritime Organization in defining the protected areas that the shipping would have to observe. Because if there's ever a crash or an accident with one of these giant tankers, we're in a place where no one can clean up the mess, and the mess will last a very long time. It's far away from all sorts of services. But in addition to that, the other more scary thing, that's a sort of manageable adaptation, is the status of the Greenland Ice Sheet. In Greenland, 20% of the water of the planet is above the land. It's a huge area, and it's melting fast. It's melting as fast or faster than the glaciers that you understand are melting here in the Himalayan mountains. And if it melts, and the acceleration of the melting continues, because it's speeding up, it won't be just a 17-foot rise in sea level that we experience around the Earth. It could be a 75-foot rise in sea level. Now, you can imagine what that means to any country that has a large coastline, as of course does Pakistan. We need to begin planning into the future to have resilience in the face of that kind of changing of the planet. It means that the traditions that IUCN has and the World Wildlife Fund and others have had, where we decide to have parks and protected areas in order to make sure that species will continue, has to change. We now have to set aside what I've been calling ecological zones for adaptation, where we will plan, if we wish to have other species continue, where should be their food? Where should be their nursery and breeding grounds? How will we maintain a livelihood for other kinds of life as well as for our own? And this affects agriculture because, of course, we have to have not just places for farming, but we have to have places where insects that are important and birds that are important for pollination can continue to thrive, or we will not have the agriculture that we all depend upon. I sketched this out for you because I think what's happening in Nairobi is of fundamental importance. We are coming up with a new global pact for the environment. I think it will emerge. I think we will get to a state in which we have a new set of ecological principles, but all of them will just be rhetoric unless the courts and those of you who practice public interest litigation in this bar association take the initiative to turn the rhetoric into plausible, credible, and effective action. This is really the challenge of environmental law in the future. It's taking rules such as environmental impact assessment, which we don't do very well, but we're going to have to do in a new way now. We're going to have environmental impact assessment for adaptation to climate change, for ensuring resilience in the face of climate change. And we can do that. The nice thing about what we've learned in my lifetime, when I was a student, there was no environmental law, nor was there in the time Dr. Parvez Hassan was a student. We had to create a whole new field of environmental law. It is infinitely humbling and rewarding to have Justice Javad and others who have carried this on be so effective and so enthusiastic about building up the field further, because it is really, as I said earlier today once, a relay race. We are passing on this work in environmental law. I was privileged to go through the museum of this High Court, and here there is a relay race in passing on the capacity for justice and the administration of justice from one generation to another. I've seen the photographs of all, or the paintings of all of the former Chief Justices. It's an extraordinary legacy you have here. So I believe that you will continue to be one of the leading parts of the world, perhaps the leading part of the world, in establishing what it means to have effective environmental rule of law during this time of climate change. Every nation faces the same set of challenges. None of us are immune from it. All of us have to learn from each other. If the nice thing about being a teacher is you always live through the eyes of your students, and they keep you young at heart, and they're the ones that will carry this all on. So as each one of you mentor a young lawyer or an up-and-coming lawyer or a law student, as each of you move on into the judiciary or into other positions in government, you are the people who are my heroes, because I have done nothing very much except help others do things. A teacher lives through the accomplishments of their students, and they are the ones that get the credit, and they are the ones in the future who will have the credit, and as we save the planet for life, have the honor of doing so. It's a privilege to have been with you today, and I wish you all the best in your work.